Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jonathan Spalter, the CEO of USTelecom, and thank you for the several hundred of you from all around the nation for joining us for two fireside, or should I actually say fiber-side chats about the innovative ways that the federal and state governments are working closely in partnership with industry to strengthen cooperation to crack down on the scourge of illegal robocalls. You know, this is a big deal. It's a big deal for our country. It's certainly a big deal for our association and also our members. I know it's a very big deal for our government partners as well. And USTelecom is proud and very honored to lead the Industry Traceback Group, which is a team of providers. You just saw the video across the wireline, wireless, VoIP, and cable industries who collaborate, often across competitive lines, to trace the source of illegal robocalls and coordinate closely with federal and state enforcement agencies to bring scammers to justice, to see them in perp walks and potentially orange suits as well. The ITG, in fact, recently was designated by the Federal Communications Commission as the official registered traceback consortium, in part, I believe, because our approach is a paradigm shift in targeting the scammers and spoofers who've hijacked our phones. And you know, we're not just going after the scammers, but the under the radar providers as well, who let these junk and illegal calls onto the networks in the first place. They have a responsibility too. And once we trace back these calls, in addition to providing valuable information to ITG members, we are very careful about making sure that we also pass on information to law enforcement officials as appropriate at both the federal and the state levels. And that's why I'm particularly pleased and honored to have both Federal Communications Commission Chair Ajit and Colorado Attorney General Phil Weiser with us today to talk about the important, the serious, and the determined strides we are making together to mitigate and hopefully one day to eliminate illegal robocalls. We're going to hear from Attorney General Weiser shortly. But first, I'd like to welcome Chairman Pai. Since arriving at the commission from the get-go, Chairman Pai really has been at the forefront of the illegal robocall battle. He's been both vocal and serious about paving a path forward towards public-private partnerships that work, designed to identify and go after these illegal scams. He's been very clear with us, with the nation, that illegal robocalls are the #1 consumer complaint that he is contending with at the FCC. And he's educated us broadly across the country about the need for joining forces and working together to make a dent in these efforts to go after our most vulnerable communities and populations. And it's working. In June, just as an example, relying on data that we were very pleased to provide to the commission by the Industry Traceback Group, the FCC proposed a $225 million fine against a Texas-based health insurance telemarketing group for making approximately 1 billion illegally spoofed robocalls, the largest in the agency's history. He also very quickly, at the outset of the national health emergency that we're navigating through, he recognized that there was a spike in what we were seeing in COVID-related scams, and he moved quickly and aggressively to go after them and to work with industry in doing so. He understands that we are in a multi-front fight against the scammers, and as a result of his leadership and these collective efforts, the FCC and Congress, the state level, the Department of Justice, the FTC and beyond, these scammers are on notice. And that's a real win for consumers. And look, even as we're beginning to watch the trend lines of illegal robocall scams begin to edge downward, we still certainly have a lot of work to do. And there really is no silver bullet to end illegal robocalls. But we are catching more criminals faster and more efficiently and protecting more consumers. So on that, thank you very much for joining us, Chairman Pai. It's great to see you this afternoon.
Well, great to see you, Jonathan. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction and for setting the stage for a robust discussion about what is the FCC's top consumer protection priority and what I know USTelecom and its members are very concerned about as well.
Well, and it's very topical and timely. In fact, just moments ago, you had let us know that now in the public record is some new regulatory steps that you're going to pursue at the Commission with respect to the fight against illegal robocalls. You know, you've been very busy in this fight. Congress certainly has added to your workload, providing the FCC a bunch of tools and responsibilities through the TRACE Act, which was a bipartisan initiative to move forward in this effort. Can you give us a little bit of insight about what the FCC is considering in terms of next steps? I know we're very eager to learn more.
Absolutely. And we are 3 weeks out, as you know, from the FCC September 30th meeting. And pursuant to a process reform I initiated in my first weeks as chairman of the commission, we have now published that document along with the other items we'll be voting on. I understand it's just gone onto the website. So folks who need some light evening reading, have at it. You'll enjoy it quite a bit. But in a nutshell, the critical item that we're dealing with respect to robocalls on September 30th involves the next step in implementation of Shake and Stir, the caller ID authentication framework. And it completes the implementation of the call authentication requirements under the TRACE Act, which you mentioned. I want to salute again Senator Thune and the bipartisan leaders in both houses who advanced that legislation. A very important item that we're going to be voting on. And in a nutshell, what it does is make clear what the obligations and deployment deadlines are for various providers with respect to caller ID authentication. So for example, Shake and Stir being an IP-based technological framework, we say that the non-IP the providers have to upgrade their networks from non-IP to IP and implement Shake and Stir by June 30th of 2021, or they essentially have to develop a non-IP based caller ID authentication framework one way or the other, so that their consumers can also benefit from these authentication efforts. We also contain some narrow targeted extensions in terms of compliance deadlines for smaller rural providers who might not have the wherewithal to implement it on that same time frame. We also call for certification in the commission database to verify that certain providers are taking steps in terms of the implementation deadlines that are spelled out. And critically, we also prohibit any providers from including line items on bills for consumers relating to some of these caller ID authentication framework requirements. And so overall, I think it's a very strong item for consumers and a strong one for industry, because what I've found is that most businesses, especially USTelecom members that I've spoken to, they don't want this junk traffic on their networks either. And so I think at the end of the day, this is a very good symbiosis of government and companies and consumers working together to achieve a common goal. And so I'm really excited about this September 30th item, and I hope that everyone watching will lend it their support too.
Good, and thank you for sharing that insight. And I know we're all going to be actually looking very closely at that item. And it is, you know, as I mentioned earlier, part of this mosaic, this multi-front effort, which includes call authentication through Shake and Stir, but it also has included providing consumers both through industry and in working collaboration with our government partners with a range of new tools that they can individually use as consumers to push back against unwanted calls. It includes also stepping up on things like enforcement, both civil and criminal. But it also has, you know, in I think in an innovative way, also included the effort to actually step up cross-industry efforts, as I mentioned, through the Industry Traceback Group to trace back through, you know, really careful government-industry collaboration in the robocall space where these calls are actually coming from. We're really pleased that the FCC has designated the Industry Traceback Group as the official registered traceback consortium. We're going to take that mandate, that charge, very seriously. And I'd just like to get your thoughts, your thinking about the importance that the ITG process and its collaboration with your enforcement bureau to identify and penalize the source of illegal calls has been playing as part of the overall wide fronts that we've established in combating not just robocalls in general, but COVID-19 scam calls in particular.
It's a great question. To me, The collaboration that we have had in government with USTelecom through the Industry Traceback Group, I believe, disproves any notion that the phrase public-private partnership is an empty cliche. In this case, it has been anything but. We've achieved incredibly concrete results. And I think the proof is in the pudding. As you mentioned, in July, our Enforcement Bureau did designate the Industry Traceback Group as the official consortium for these efforts. And that's based on a track record of success just over the last several months. You mentioned very kindly the enforcement action that we took, the largest fine ever proposed in the FCC's history, $225 million. We were able to take that action thanks in part to information supplied by the Industry Traceback Group. And that's just obviously the banner headline. To me, one of the most notable results over the last 6 months that we've gotten in collaboration with the ITG involves the gateway providers. These are small companies that many people have never heard the names of, but they were actually the gateway, literally, for a lot of these illegal or junk robocalls that were flooding into the country. And because the Industry Traceback Group did the critical legwork of identifying, here's where the traffic is coming from, here's the gateway provider based in the United States that is then launching that traffic onto broader US telephone networks, we were able to, in collaboration with the Federal Trade Commission and Department of Justice, to send letters once in February, then again in May, to some of these gateway providers. And we told them, these gateway providers, look, you have 48 hours to either cut off the source of these robocalls or risk being cut off yourselves from the US telephone network. And I will say that for a while we were wondering, well, 48 hours, how many of them are actually going to pay attention to this? The results were incredible. Every single one of them we sent a letter to. The 5 robocall, the gateway providers, as well as one originating provider, ended that stream of robocalls within the 48-hour period. And so to us, at least, the vindication of the Industry Traceback Group as an important model of public-private cooperation has been substantial. And so I'm really looking forward to the results we can achieve in the future, both on gateway providers, future enforcement actions, or just more broadly, trying to provide consumers and companies the tools they need in order to stop this flood of illegal robocalls.
Well, I agree with you, and we are determined to be on those barricades with you as we move forward. But one of the nuances that you're pointing to, and as a follow-up, I think what I'm hearing you say is that it's safe to say that the FCC is no longer just focused on calling parties that violate the TCPA, but also on those voice service providers that are intentionally enabling the placement of these calls or are intentionally turning a blind eye through not sins of omission, but sins of commission to the fact that their networks or platforms are being used to place these illegal calls. Is that a fair reading?
I think that's absolutely right. The gateway providers, as I mentioned, we've taken targeted action on. One other aspect of the item we're going to be voting on September 30th that I didn't mention involves intermediate providers, so folks who are not at the beginning of the chain, not the end of the chain, but in the middle of that phone call chain. And we're going to be imposing requirements on them as well to implement Shake and Stir by that June 2021 deadline. And so for us, at least, it's really a holistic approach that wherever the robocall may be originating from, whoever may be carrying it, and wherever it ends, we want to make sure that from the consumer perspective, at least, what matters is that they are either not getting these robocalls at all, or there's very strong caller ID authentication technology that enables them to know this is not a call I should answer because it's clearly spoofed or likely to be spoofed. So that's going to be a really significant tool for them.
Sure. You know, not to get too deeply into the weeds of the nuances of the different kinds of robocalls, but you mentioned call authentication and its importance in blocking illegal or unwanted robocalls. It is an issue, and it's one that's important that we draw clear distinctions. How do you effectively balance the need to block illegal and unwanted calls with the need to ensure that legal and wanted calls can get through? And how do you actually establish that balance in policy?
That's a very good question. Both are legitimate interests that we need to take into account. And certainly when it comes to illegal robocalls, we've clearly pulled out the stops. A bunch of other steps that I haven't mentioned yet, of course, but making clear that companies can block clearly illegal robocalls by default using advanced analytics and other types of technologies like that. But at the same time, we create a safe harbor, so to speak, for those legitimate calls or calls that in good faith are being placed. So for example, if a consumer wants to get a call from a pharmacy or from his or her child's school, those are the types of things, that communications that we want to make sure are not inadvertently blocked. And 911 is another good example of that. Not a robocall necessarily, but
Right.
those are the types of calls that we don't want to get thrown out along with the bathwater, so to speak. So it's always a balance that we think about very hard, and our staff has done a tremendous job on all of these different items, including this one that's coming up on September 30th, of balancing those two interests.
Okay, that's good to know. One of the themes that we're talking about today is the intensely important role that partnership plays within and between the industry, government, the public-private axis. But equally important, and you've also been given leadership and taking a comprehensive approach towards this, is the partnership that has to exist within and between government agencies, both at the federal level and at the state level, the FCC, the FTC, state attorneys general, all working closely together. Can you talk a little bit about why robocalls demand this kind of collective, coordinated, harmonized, all hands on deck action, and whether you think the collaborative efforts are working, or where we actually need to be giving more both operational and policy-making thought about how to improve those coordinating mechanisms?
A good question. In my view, the cross-agency collaboration on the federal level has been excellent, and I think it actually provides a model for collaboration on other non-robocall related issues. For example, our Enforcement Bureau regularly consults with federal partners across the federal government, the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, the Social Security Administration, and a variety of other agencies on the federal level. And I think that speaks to the fact that robocalls implicate a wide variety of agencies' jurisdiction. And so that suggests then that to find a comprehensive solution, we need to make sure that our federal partners are plugged in as much as possible. And the same goes with our partners on the state level. I know Attorney General Weiser has been a leader on this effort, and many other state attorneys general have as well. And we've been a part of that. There's an interagency working group that we've been invited to participate in by the Department of Justice that involves some of the state AGs. In addition to that, we have asked some groups to come up with best practices that any state government can adopt in order to make sure that we're all on the same page in this regard. And so I think it's a very great cross-federal effort and a federal state effort that, again, speaks to the fact that the more cops on the beat we can have in this area, the better. We don't have a monopoly on wisdom, and we want to make sure that we collect all of that expertise from any agency that might happen to have it.
I don't know if it was propinquity, but literally, as you said, Attorney General Weiser's name, he popped up on our Zoom, so that was great. And we will welcome the Attorney General more formally in just a moment. But I do have one more question for you, and this is an important other axis in the fight that we've all been on the barricades of against illegal robocalls. When we think of illegal robocallers victims, we often think about consumers that are receiving, that are on the unfortunate side of these scams. But it's not just consumers that are the only ones that are receiving robocalls, but we know that enterprises, including important critical enterprises, especially now, like hospitals, also are suffering the scourge from determined foes who are looking to scam them at the enterprise level. Now, you've recognized this, and the FCC has wisely established it's called the Hospital Robocall Protection Group, to look into the specific, unique operational and technical issues and legal challenges that hospitals are facing in combating robocalls. Can you tell us a little bit about this unique problem from your perspective and what you hope this working group will be able to achieve?
Absolutely. This is something that I think most people might be unaware of, and once they realize that it's a problem, might be shocked that it exists. But it came home to me a couple of years ago when I visited a hospital. The purpose of that visit was telehealth and talking about the innovative things that hospital was doing to reach patients in hard-to-serve, lower-income urban and rural areas. But I happened to take aside one of the folks in the meeting and say, "Oh, what other issues are you facing?" He actually brought up the fact that they get a ton of robocalls, and it floods the network, their network at least at the time, and causes them significant problems because their focus is on making sure that they can match, of course, medical expertise to patients who need it. They don't have the time or the wherewithal to deal with this flood of robocalls. So in conjunction with a congressional requirement, we've set up that hospital protection robocall working group as a federal advisory committee. And our hope is that using the expertise of the various members who come from a variety of different backgrounds, we will be able to come up with some solutions that help these healthcare providers attack this problem, especially now when, of course, everybody knows that we are dealing with an unprecedented national health emergency. We need to make sure that the folks who are on the front lines, namely our first responders, our healthcare providers, and others in the healthcare space, can focus on targeting the people who need the help, not on fending off this scourge that everybody wants to put in the rear window at this point.
And let us put it squarely in our rear window as we're moving forward. Let us continue the dynamic and evolving public-private partnership that we're so glad to be architecting with you, and the prioritization that you've given to that partnership and to the innovation that's required, both on the part of government agencies, but also we in industry, to do collective problem solving together. And when we have the bipartisan wind in our backs to be able to do so, real solutions and real results can happen for consumers. So thank you, Chairman Pai, for your time, for your leadership, and for your partnership.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. And I'd be remiss if I didn't put in a plug for the FCC's incredible career staff from our Wireline Competition Bureau, our Enforcement Bureau, and elsewhere. They are the ones who are really at the vanguard fighting this fight. And we couldn't achieve any of these results, of course, without the cooperation of you and your members, but also without the hard work of these dedicated public servants who really believe in protecting consumers and vindicating this top consumer protection priority. So any credit we get properly belongs to them.
Agreed, and thank you. And you mentioned those who are on the vanguard of this fight, and certainly we also know that it is our states and leaders in our states that are truly on the vanguard, are on the front lines of combating illegal robocalls, and which is why I really have, I'm very happy to introduce my colleague, the Colorado Attorney General, Phil Weiser, this afternoon. It's good to see you, Attorney General Weiser. As I mentioned earlier, the fight against illegal robocalls isn't just happening at the federal level. It's demanding, it's requiring strong engagement from state enforcement agencies. And you, Attorney General Weiser, have really known and have shown, not just in word, but in deed, the critical importance of collaboration since day one of forging bipartisan approaches to this challenge. And you have been a leader among peers. We were proud that you have helped lead 51 state attorneys general to commit to important anti-robocalling principles designed to protect consumers, both consumers, but also enterprises that are impacted by this challenge, and also to sort of stoke the engine of innovation and enhance the ability of industry and government agencies together to take action collectively against bad actors. I got to tell you that we at the Industry Traceback Group at USTelecom are all in. We're really committed to supporting state attorneys general in identifying and really going after these illegal robocallers. We value the close relationship that we've been able to forge with you, to learn from you and your efforts that you've undertaken in Colorado, and as well as those with other attorneys general across the country. And we're really looking forward to hearing more about what you see as the opportunities and the remaining challenges. So, Attorney General Weiser, Phil, welcome to our gathering today.
It's great to be with you. And this is indeed a model of collaboration, as you said, which has been across party lines, working together to solve problems. And that's this spirit here in Colorado. That's the American spirit. And what I want to give US Telecom a big shout out is you've been, like you said, all in, leaning forward, figuring out how do we make progress in this critical issue. We wouldn't have the Trace Act without your leadership and the technological leadership moving to this new standard. I always say, Shake and Stir must be a James Bond fan who created it. It is a important step because we need this technology like we had in spam, there's technological solutions. We have to couple those with legal solutions. In the case of spam, requirements that people give opt-out rights for legitimate folks. In the case of robocalls, we also need the enforcement, and we have the tools to do that enforcement, but we need the leads. We are often frustrated because if the spammers or the robocallers are a step ahead of us and we can't find them, we can't do anything. It's the technological tools and the collaboration helping us go after them. It builds confidence in our phone system. If people feel like they can't trust their phone system, they'll stop using it. And we need to make sure that people know the system's trustworthy. And you're mentioning hospitals before. It really scares me because some of these scammers are pretending to be hospitals. And they can even spoof the numbers so it looks like it's coming from a hospital. So people will answer it, and then they can get taken in by that. So this is a major consumer protection issue. It's a big priority, and again, I applaud your leadership on it.
Well, and yours, right back at you. General Weiser, I mentioned that you are on the front lines. You're the lead enforcement officer in the state of Colorado. It would be really interesting. We have several hundred participants tuned in from across the country. What are you hearing and what are you seeing in Colorado in real terms with your boots on the ground in terms of kind of robocall, illegal robocall activity that are harming your citizens?
The scammers are clever, and they're going to keep looking for ways to get people to trust them and to share information that people will regret sharing. Let me give you an example of a robocall scheme that's happening now in pretending to be the Boulder Health Department doing a contact tracing scheme. And the call comes in and they say, someone you know just got COVID. We need you to come in for a test. Just give me your credit card. That is a clever robocall. And they literally just go down. And a lot of times the way these things work is until you answer the phone, they won't get you to a real person. Or even they'll have some pre-recorded something and then they'll get you to real. So they try to make sure they've got you on the hook, if you will, before they give you a real person. And this is a clever tactic. It is a dangerous one because again, it undermines trust in our public health system when people get these fraudulent calls. A second one that's going around now is a texting scheme, which we'll have to work on that next, Jonathan, how we do something about that, because it's saying that you've got a package from the Postal Service.
Yep.
And I just got one of these today, actually.
I did too.
Yep. It's again, playing on people's anxieties about the postal system, trying to get people baited. And the goal is always the same. Get people to give up information, social security number, checking account, credit card number, and then the person is going to find themselves in a world of hurt.
Right. Well, and you are fighting back. I mentioned that you were in the vanguard of rallying 51 of your colleagues from every state in the country and the District of Columbia, a rare moment of that kind of policy solidarity to join a dozen voice service providers in signing what have been called the Anti-Robocall Principles. And these are important principles that were elaborated by you and your colleagues, outlining the steps that responsible providers should be taking to protect consumers. I think it would be useful if you can talk a little bit about the general range of principles that it advanced, and why you and your colleagues across the country felt it so important in this unusual moment of literally, truly national solidarity to lead that effort.
My wife loves this issue because it indeed represents something that's about solidarity. I was doing an interview about what we're doing on robocalls, and during the interview, I got a robocall. And it shows you what a scourge this is. The issue is indeed trust in our system. That is what is at stake. And it's a major, major challenge. I wanted to just read a little bit of what we have here because it's important. One is the implement the stir, state, shaken, which again, I said shaken, not stirred, but stir, shaken in this case. And then also having analyzing the nature of traffic. So we can start identifying and then investigating suspicious calls and call patterns. Super important. And also is confirming the identity so that we can authenticate who's real, who's not. And then all this gives you data which you can start labeling calls as potential spam. And a lot of people now are getting these potential spam labels. It's super important because that gives people the signal they need not to pick it up. I actually tell people, if you don't know the phone call number, don't pick it up at all. But if you see potential spam, you know it's not real, just like with the email. So that's a super valuable. And then, of course, how we cooperate together is really valuable because we need the information that you're getting access to go after people, make an example of people. A lot of times they're not in this country, so that's not easy to do. But where we can, we want to enforce our laws, protect consumers, and your cooperation as part of these principles is critical to that.
You know, one of the specific things that was actually written in the letter that you advanced was, you said, the letter stated, quote, "The partnership between the ITG and the state attorneys general is a crucial one, and that the state attorneys general plan to continue intensifying our enforcement efforts against illegal robocallers and other related bad actors." It'd be interesting for our audience to understand how you, as the key state enforcement officials and other state attorneys general, can use your offices and your tools and your resources in collaboration with the Industry Traceback Group to intensify overall enforcement efforts. Can you walk us through the role that state enforcement plays?
Yes, so we want to be able to go after these fraudulent entities, and we need the data. So as you identify, oh, we're getting a lot of calls coming from this entity, and these calls don't look legitimate, we then have the ability to investigate and say, no, they're not. There's some sort of scheme like the one I mentioned, the Boulder health scam. And then we can go after them. We have a variety of tools. We've got a pretty broad consumer protection law in Colorado, like a lot of states. If it's a deceptive conduct, if it's unfair conduct, we've got civil penalties. We want to make them pay. We want to make an example of those scammers out there who are really preying on people. But again, we got to get the leads to do that. And you have the data about what's happening on your networks, what's suspicious activity, what looks like it's actually being spoofed, because a lot of times, as you all know, these calls are made to look like they come from the local number of the person who's receiving them. And then that gives us what we need to do our work.
You know, one of the things I'd like to explore with you as well, if you can just take a step back and look at the broader implications of this national effort that we've been working together towards in fighting against illegal robocalls. One of its key hallmarks is that this truly has been a bipartisan effort. You know, look, we're right now in the midst of a pretty heated political season. Those who are in elected office have been, you know, subject to suggestions that nothing can get done in American politics. I think that this initiative that we've all joined together in trying to find solution towards is proof positive that no things can get done. But do you see this bipartisan consensus continuing in the future, or do you see that there might be fissures that will upend it, and where might those be?
The good news from my vantage point, both Colorado and state AGs, is things look very different than they look in Washington. And so for those of you out there who are Washington-centric and somewhat dismayed by both the rhetoric and the lack of collaboration, I would tell you, look at state AGs and look at Colorado. On the state AG front, we're working together collaboratively on robocalls, also on issues like opioids and other matters that we collaborate on a regular basis, how we work together. That's the ethos of state AGs. Because the rule of law provides a rigor to us and a little bit of a roadmap, things are not necessarily the free-for-all political food fight you see in DC. Right. The second vantage point I have is Colorado, where I worked on a number of legislative efforts. All of them were bipartisan, whether it's reforming cash bail, I mentioned reforming our consumer protection law, we just had a police reform bill passed recently. All of these efforts have been bipartisan because in Colorado, we'll take a good idea wherever it comes from. And that's what this country is really about. I do believe that's where we need our capital and Washington to get back to. There was a time when we saw more bipartisan collaborative problem solving. We did see it with the Trace Act, so it's not totally dead, but it is pretty rare when we see it. Thankfully, again, in my world, state AGs in Colorado, it's not a rare thing.
And that's good to hear. And I agree with you that there have been sort of a safe harbor created in the issue of robocalls at the federal level, where we see bipartisan progress being made. You had mentioned the TRACE Act, a singularly important step, the bipartisan consensus against an extremely important consumer challenge. But it's not just the TRACE Act, it's the fact that the federal approaches have actually worked in this domain, setting rules at the national level for call authentication, call blocking, for example, approach that we at USTelecom generally support. We've seen a lot of progress at the federal level. But at the same time, and this goes back to the state federal dynamic, we are seeing some states beyond enforcement beginning to consider their own state level rules with respect to robocalls. New York, California, with respect to call authentication, ISP targeted rules that are only implicating internet service providers at a state level. There is, of course, a national debate that's been going on about the proper equilibrium between state and federal approaches to a communications policy. But what is your perspective on the appropriate role of the state? Where do you think there is a state role beyond enforcement, if there is one? Or is this an area that's best left to federal government with close coordination with states on the enforcement front?
And let me answer this question also acknowledging the related area of consumer privacy. Mm-hmm. Consumer privacy is an area we've not seen federal legislation on. When I was working under President Obama in the White House, we proposed a privacy bill of rights. It was a framework for giving consumers more awareness, control. It didn't pass. We've since seen other measures, including California, which passed one pretty quickly with a lot of consequences to it, which is filling the vacuum. Other states have been looking at data privacy laws. We have as well. So one role for the states is where the feds have failed to act, you can call this a second best strategy. Better have state action than no action. In the best of all worlds, the states are acting as laboratories of democracy with approaches that can be perfected and adopted on the federal level. Mm-hmm. And then when we do get a federal law, like we may someday on data privacy, I believe it's important to have state enforcement of that law, like we have with robocalls, and like we have under the Dodd-Frank law, where state AGs can enforce federal law. So to answer your question, my theory about state enforcement is where you don't have federal enforcement at all, the federal government has been an absentee actor, like in privacy, states can pick up the slack. Where maybe it's too uncertain what the best approach is, states can experiment. And then ultimately, I think states should be partners in what is often called a cooperative federalism, where the states help to implement, in some cases, do some local tailoring, but it's important that the states are acting within a coherent framework, because I know that can be a real interest on companies if they've got literally contradictory messages from one state to another, and that is suboptimal, and when you've got a federal regime, hopefully avoidable.
Right. And I think it's the record now is bearing out very clearly that there's a very positive trajectory of coherent, cohesive, determined, and so far effective federal level engagement across the waterfront, both technologically, process, and enforcement. So perhaps that bodes well for a more harmonized national and federal approach, federal framework, rather than what might become a mosaic of complicating and challenging state level engagements. But beyond that, I wanted to, just get your other thoughts on what are the criteria that you would like to sort of establish as benchmarks for what Colorado wants to achieve in terms of your own robocall agenda when it comes to litigation, when it comes to lawsuits, when it comes to enforcement. And do you think we're going to be seeing more action by state AGs going forward in these types of areas?
Yes, absolutely. States are committed to enforcing this. As we have opportunities to take action against bad actors, we will. We'll also be very active in consumer education. That's another role we can play. We're close to consumers, including to adopt technologies like the ones that give you awareness about calls that are spam calls, as well as telling consumers, if you don't recognize the number, let it go to voicemail. If they're legitimate, they'll leave a voicemail. If they're not, they won't. So consumer education, particularly for older Coloradans, is something we pay a lot of attention to. We've actually got a partnership here in Colorado with ARP. We call it ARP Elder Watch, and it's a way to help protect people. And robocalls are often one of the first topics that we address.
Well said. And by the way, this is part of, the just recently, as a great example of what you were just referring to, we had talked with Chairman Pai about the proposed FCC $225 million historic level fine by the commission, that 7 states filed a 20-count lawsuit against an entity accused of enabling billions of illegal healthcare-related robocalls. You've mentioned the importance of this vector in our fight. So I completely applaud and encourage, and really looking forward to working side by side with you and your colleagues in advancing this common goal of reducing the risks to our citizens, our enterprises, our states, our communities, our families from this scourge. Any last words, Attorney General Weiser, before we thank you for your time with us?
Well, I just want to say, I know that there's a lot of, as you noted, skepticism out there, cynicism. I think this is a story that is honestly inspiring about what productive collaboration looks like. We need to take this example, and whether we're talking about privacy or broadband deployment, we've got to find ways to work together to address these goals. The American people deserve that sort of work. That's the work that I've been committed to doing in my career in public service, and it's why I'm excited to be Colorado's Attorney General. So thanks for being a part of that, Jonathan. Thanks for having me here. It's great to visit with you.
It's been a privilege, and thank you for your work, your commitment, your service, and also your innovation that you're bringing to this and many other issues. So Attorney General Weiser, thank you for joining us. And I'm also glad, on that theme of collaboration and partnership, I want to turn it over to my colleague, our Senior Vice President for Policy and Advocacy, Patrick Halley, who's going to lead a conversation with some real expert colleagues who bring a lot of thought and care and work to this issue. Colleagues from the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., the Federal Trade Communication, and our very own members and ITG participants, executives from Twilio and Verizon, who themselves also are very much on the front lines of this effort. So again, thank you, Attorney General Weiser, Chairman Pai, and I'll turn it over to you, Patrick. Good being with you.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. If I could invite the 4 panelists to please unmute and turn their videos on. We'll get started. Don't be afraid to show your face, Chris. There we go. Thank you, Jonathan. And it's great to be followed by Chairman Pai and Attorney General Weiser, leaders at the national level, obviously at the FCC and within the state of Colorado, but more generally on behalf of all of the state attorneys general who we are working very closely with. It is great to be joined by colleagues from the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice, specifically Lois Greisman, who is the Associate Director of the Division of Marketing Practices at the FTC, as well as Entwistle, who is the trial attorney in the Consumer Protection Branch at the Department of Justice. And as Jonathan mentioned, we're also joined by Chris Oatway, Associate General Counsel from Verizon, and Rebecca Murphy-Thompson, Head of Communications Policy and Global Public Policy and Government Affairs at Twilio, 2 leaders within the Industry Traceback Group and within USTelecom. I want to pick up on something that Chairman Pai said in response to a question from Jonathan that I think everyone here will acknowledge, which is that there seems to have been a paradigm shift within the last year, both at the state level, within Congress, within the federal agencies, that there's a recognition that merely focusing on the entities that are making the calls themselves, right? The company or the individual often who literally says, I'm going to make millions of phone calls and here's all the numbers I'm going to dial, the calling party, as we might call it. There's been an acknowledgement that if we only focus on the calling party itself, we'll never win. Because those people can only make millions of illegal robocalls to U.S. citizens if they have an on-ramp to do it, which is the voice service providers or the platforms that enable those calls. And the fact that the enforcement apparatus within this country at the federal and state level, I think, is looking not just at the calling party, but also the voice service providers. And that is a new phenomenon, really, at least for me. and I think it's important. So Lois, I want to start with you. Certainly the Federal Trade Commission has been a leader in this space for a while now. And you started the year off in January by sending letters to 19 different VoIP providers, reminding them that, quote, assisting and facilitating illegal telemarketing or robocalling is against the law. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by facilitating and assisting illegal robocalling and why it's against the law? For example, can you talk a little bit about the FTC's telemarketing sales rule or anything else you think that makes that against the law?
Yes, thank you, Patrick. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Good. My thanks to you, USTelecom, and of course the ITG in particular for your leadership in this area. So actually, it was in December 2019 that we used our assisting and facilitating authority to sue Globex Telecom. And I think that's the first federal case against a gateway provider for assisting and facilitating illegal telemarketing. And that was followed in January, as you note, by 19 letters to VoIP providers and providers of DID numbers. So the telemarketing sales rule prohibits assisting and facilitating, and it spells it out as providing a substantial assistance or support to an entity that you know or consciously avoid knowing is violating the telemarketing sales rule. So there's both a substantial, you have to do something that's significant, not bring in lunch, and with some level of knowledge that illegal activity is going on. And we've used it very successfully in Globex cases and litigation, but we've used assisting and facilitating in other elements involving telemarketing, such as lead generation, or just providing DID numbers or providing the dialing platform. We've gone after such entities for assisting and facilitating illegal telemarketing. My screen is a little frozen at the moment.
There you go, you're back.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Lois. So Anne, in January, the Department of Justice issued separate lawsuits against toll-free deals and Global Voicecom for their role in enabling fraudulent scams against American consumers. I think this was, at least to my knowledge, the first time DOJ had done that. Can you provide an overview of those cases and the status of the lawsuits? And is this something that DOJ continues to be actively focused on?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. And thank you to USTelecom and the ITG for inviting the Justice Department to be here today. In both of those cases, the Department of Justice alleged that these US-based VoIP carriers were gateway carriers who were engaging in wire fraud, the federal crime of wire fraud, by knowingly facilitating fraudulent robocalls, including massive hundreds of millions of Social Security imposter fraud calls. It was a case we worked on very closely with investigators at the Social Security Administration. Similar to the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice is committed to prosecuting any entities, whether they are the call originator, the caller, or any entity that knowingly facilitates these calls and in that way participates in these vicious frauds. So as you say, these were the first cases that the Department of Justice had brought seeking injunctions to immediately stop these two sets of US-based gateway carriers from transmitting any VoIP calls to US consumers and from selling phone numbers, which the government also alleged was part of the fraud, that they were selling US callback numbers. Both of these cases, these were, as I say, they were civil injunction cases under 18 USC 1345, a statute that allows the Justice Department to seek an immediate injunction, a restraining order, to stop ongoing fraudulent conduct. In both of these cases, both sets of defendants, these VoIP carriers and their owner-operators, agreed to settle the cases, which involved entry of permanent injunctions, permanently barring them from transmitting VoIP calls or selling US phone numbers. And I think the end of your question was whether these are cases that the Justice Department is still investigating, and absolutely, Patrick. The Justice Department, elder fraud is one of our primary commitments as far as crimes that we are looking to stop, and we are absolutely committed to using all tools, both civil and criminal, and looking at all players in these complex fraud schemes, certainly including any voice carriers who are knowingly and intentionally facilitating these frauds.
Got it. So I want to turn to my colleagues from industry, but it sounds like there's a sort of, Attorney General Weiser talked about his consumer protection law within the state of Colorado, and there are other states who have similar laws. And you've got the telemarketing sales rule at the Federal Trade Commission. You have wire fraud and just sort of fraud laws at the federal level that can be enforced. Of course, the TCPA, the Truth in Caller ID Act. There's plenty of different laws. I mean, frankly, it's almost confusing if you're a calling party at this point to figure out how to be in compliance with all these laws. But I think that's kind of the point, right? If you're going to get in this business, you're going to be calling millions of Americans at any time. You should probably figure out what these laws are, and you should probably figure out, if you're going to be enabling calling parties to make millions of calls into the US, whether or not your customers comply with them. I assume you would agree with that statement.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's turn to you, Chris. As a leader within the Industry Traceback Group, Verizon certainly is, and you certainly are. Industry's doing a lot to combat illegal robocalls. Can you talk about, from your perspective, what are the 2 or 3 most critical activities that are going on right now to address this problem? And what's making the biggest difference for consumers?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and thanks for having me on. Let me just echo the comments made previously about the importance of the industry, government partnership. We're thrilled to be moving in the direction of restoring faith in voice calls again. I mean, we're in the business of selling voice service, and it's a real problem when folks don't trust their own caller ID and their, the calls coming into their phones. I would put it into 3 buckets very briefly. One is, the first line of defense needs to be opt-in or opt-out blocking tools that consumers can avail themselves of. And the FCC has done an awesome job in the regulatory world of green lighting deploying blocking services on an opt-out basis. Get it out to the customer, because there's friction and there's inertia that causes a lot of consumers to not affirmatively go download a service. And so a year and a half ago, the FCC gave us that green light. Verizon is all in on blocking on behalf of consumers that don't want to get certain types of calls. I think our flagship call filter blocking tool is now out to over 70 million Verizon customers, something that we were able to do because of the opt-out green light that the FCC put out there. So that's, I think, a first line of defense. It's crucial. There's more to come. We're improving it. That's not the end of the story, of course. The other is stir shaken's crucial. I mean, we recognized early on that there's a collectivity problem where some service providers may not implement stir shaken if there's no mandate. So we supported the Trace Act, and we realized that the FCC was already heading in the mandate direction even before the Trace Act, I think, and that's crucial to restoring trust in caller ID, which is part of the overall picture. But I think maybe the underappreciated one is the Industry Traceback Group itself, Patrick. We're thrilled to be able to partner and really strengthen the partnership to bring bad guys to justice and to do more on enforcement. And I think we can strengthen that further. There's automation and other things that I think will be in the pipeline. But you alluded to this early on, Patrick, which is that there's also a policy, an opportunity that I think is underappreciated, to use ITG and Traceback as a policy tool, to start in a data-driven way, find out ways to identify those service providers that are looking the other way, and find ways to green light not doing business with them, green light foisting some heightened obligations on them in terms of knowing that their customers aren't bad actors. Those kinds of policy vehicles, I think, can flow from the ITG. So we're really excited about finding ways to, per your point, really put an onus on service providers that aren't acting responsibly, and require and calling them out, and actually finding ways to require them to behave better.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I want to come back to that, Chris. Rebecca, you see this issue from a slightly different perspective as a company that provides a platform for companies to communicate, whether that's via text or via making calls. So we were delighted to have Twilio join the Industry Traceback Group. And I'm just, from your perspective, why was it important for Twilio to be a member of the Industry Traceback Group? And as somebody who is working with different enterprises and companies who are in the business of placing calls, among other things, how do you work to actually know who your customers are? Because I'll tell you, one of the things that's frustrating as I look through all the tracebacks that we're doing and we get to sort of the source of the call, you realize people have no idea who they're signing up. That's a problem. So how did you tackle that? You're away.
Thank you. Thank you. And I would be remiss, I think, if I didn't echo sentiments of my former panelists as well. I do want to thank the state attorneys general, the FCC, the FTC, DOJ, Congress, but, in particular, you, Patrick, and USTelecom, I think to use Chairman Pai's word, we're really encouraged by the progress of the symbiosis of this private-public efforts that have helped to curb illegal robocalls. And a part of that effort, a huge part of that effort, is the ITG, which we believe is one of the key elements to bringing back trust to the public telephone network. So yeah, as you noted, Twilio is a cloud-based communications company that helps power all sorts of channels of communications. And I believe we are the first cloud company to join the ITG. So that is a source of a lot of pride for us. It seems that there's a growing desire, especially during this pandemic, of enterprises, small businesses, nonprofits, some of the ones that Jonathan and State AG Weiser already mentioned, to find innovative ways to engage with their customers. So it's really important for Twilio to work with our ITG colleagues to, first and foremost, stop the bad calls, but also to restore consumers' faith in that wanted calls will be received. So as Twilio's CEO has said often, trust is the most important thing in the cloud. So highlighted by that is really been us joining the ITG, as well as the state AG AntiRobocall agreement. That underscores the need for Twilio to vet our customers. And we have been, over the past couple years, implementing new Know Your Customer KYC procedures, largely based, or at least from a baseline on the parameters given within the state AG principles. Knowing customers' location, physical location, contact information, federal text ID, and we're building on that because trust is so important. We've actually established a consumer trust team over the past year that collects business entity information to provide seamless but also compliant access to all communications channels. And we're also really proud that we've launched Stake and Stir already. And with that, we've launched a product called Branded Calling, which empowers consumers to know who is calling and why. So, those are just some of the ways that I think we're attempting to know who are making these calls, who's using our platform, and working with ITG to curb these illegal robocalls.
Got it. Just Lois or Ann or Chris, anything you want to add on this sort of notion of know your customer? Because it is one of the things that we struggle with within the ITG is so often we will get to the point where we get sort of, after multiple hops within a particular call, which sort of get close to figuring out who it is that actually made the call. Well, the only thing we'll know about the entity is that they have a Gmail address and maybe what country they're in. And even then, we just have to take the word for it that the person is telling us that's the right contact information in the right country, that it's correct. And so it can be a challenge. And so just anything anyone else wants to add about the importance of all voice service providers sort of knowing who their customers are as the requirement.
Well, I think it makes enormous sense as a matter of policy, as a matter of law. Of course, the FCC has a request for comment that I think went out in March that is going to touch upon this. We don't have anyone from the FCC on this panel, but I'd like to be optimistic. It is an issue that they will be tackling. I think also as we are more active in this area against gateway providers within our jurisdiction, I think it is something that we will be looking at very closely.
Yeah, I think know your customer is kind of the linchpin of really putting in place a foundation where there's going to be some lasting trust here. The AG principles were just a very nice baseline. At a very minimum, you should know who your customer is and kind of where to find them, right? So if Ann or Lois, come knocking and send a, subpoena, the service provider can say, here's the customer. You want to go talk to them? Here's where to find them. And but then there should be more. There should be monitoring something about the customer's traffic. We look at things like call duration rates and unanswer rates and how spammy and how much spoof traffic are coming from customers, just to get a sense as to whether or not there might be someone misusing the platform. And that needs to be in place. I look forward to seeing what the FCC actually has in underway with respect to its obligation actually under the Trace Act to implement a robocall mitigation framework where if you're not implementing stir shaken, you at least have to have some basic procedures in place as a service provider to make sure that when you originate calls, you're not originating illegal robocalls. And I think that holds promise. We've got a proposal in, very similar to USTelecom's proposal on how that should work. And look forward to kind of seeing, as Lois says, how that plays out in the FCC space.
Great. Lois and Ann, can you talk a little bit about, we've heard a lot about sort of the coordination, and both Chairman Pai and Attorney General Weiser talked about it, but can you talk a little bit about how you coordinate with other federal agencies or even the states, for example, to make sure that what we're doing is coordinated? And can you talk about sort of the value in which the information that's provided from the tracebacks that the ITG conducts assists that effort?
So I'm happy to start. Let me pick up the second half in terms of the value added by ITG. I mean, if you look at the 2 recent rounds of warning letters that FTC sent out jointly with FCC, the letters themselves explicitly reference the collaboration with the ITG. And on top of that, the ITG received letters directly from, joint letters from FCC and FTC thanking them for their assistance in that work. And the assistance wasn't just in those rounds, the prior rounds that I mentioned, the January round, 19 letters, and there was another 9 that went out in March. Ann and I talk a lot, and we don't just talk among ourselves. I mean, just as an example, when the coronavirus hit, I don't know, we formed weekly working groups with teams throughout the federal enforcement agencies to discuss what was going on, to coordinate, to deconflict. And that's really been the model for the coronavirus-related robocalls as well. And it hasn't just been at the federal level. We're doing this through the state AGs, through NAG. There were weekly and now less frequent meetings on that. And the goal is that, it always is a target-rich environment. And the last thing you want to do is deploy your resources inefficiently. Yet in some cases, it does make a lot of sense to team up. It does make a lot of sense to send joint warning letters or to have state co-plaintiffs work with us. But the goal is to use our limited resources in as efficient and effective a way as possible. And the only way that happens is by Ann and I talking, and us talking to our colleagues throughout the federal government at the state level.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on what Lois said, I know that's absolutely true, and the Justice Department is so grateful that in this area we have such great partners at various federal agencies, at the FTC, FCC, and increasing relationships with state attorneys general so that we can work together, as Lois says, deconflict, make sure that as we have slightly different statutory or regulatory powers, that we can use them in the most effective way to make the biggest impact. And on the question of how we use information that we get from the ITG, pointing to those two lawsuits that the department filed in January, some of the evidence that the department submitted in those cases included that both of those defendants had received dozens of notifications from the ITG containing explicitly fraudulent voicemails notifying them that their customers were transmitting these calls. And that served as one piece of evidence that the court in a preliminary injunction finding found helped to show the knowledge that these defendants had of the calls that they were transmitting, that they were not able to say, you know, we just transmit the calls, we can't hear content because from various places, from subpoenas from state AGs, from various law enforcement partners who were investigating, and from the ITG, they were repeatedly being put on notice. Your customers are committing blatant fraud and you're carrying those calls.
So the FCC, in a recent notice of proposed rulemaking, basically asked the question, among others, should they mandate that voice service providers respond to Industry Traceback Group requests? From your perspective, anybody, do you think providers have an obligation to respond to Industry Traceback Groups? And from the government and from the industry side, is there anything that you are doing or can do to essentially require it?
So I'll jump in, unless somebody else wants to take the lead.
Go for it.
All
Go ahead, Lois. I'll jump in after.
So whether it should be required, I think, is within the FCC's bailiwick based upon the rulemaking record. What the lens I look at that through, whether or not there's an obligation to respond, is that I go back to the assisting and facilitating. Do they know, or are they consciously avoiding knowing something illegal is going on? And the refusal to respond, even in the absence of an obligation, raises some scintilla of knowledge in my mind. They know something's going on. Are they going to bury their head in the sand, or are they going to they're going to be proactive about it, or are they going to do something in between, try to monitor, keep an eye on it, but not necessarily respond?
Yeah, Patrick, I was going to note that the Trace Act kind of specifically tees up the fact that the FCC is permitted, for example, to leverage the Industry Traceback Group, and if it wants to start publishing lists of companies that are non-responsive, I think that's kind of explicitly invited by the statute, and that sort of approach, whether it's a naming, a shaming, or a direct regulatory mandate, it seems to me needs to be in play. From Verizon's point of view, we take a substantial amount of traffic from what are called wholesale customers, where we have contracts with upstream carriers that are receiving traffic either from end users or from other robocallers, and then they're using Verizon to terminate that traffic to whatever the carrier is that owns the customer and is terminating it to the end user. We've required our wholesale customers to sign what we call a traceback amendment for more than a year, where we basically don't want to do business with you if you're not willing to participate in tracebacks. And so, some of it's happening on its own in industry. I think it's becoming increasingly rare that folks just sort of say, forget it, not going to participate. But perhaps there should be some discussion of a regulatory backdrop as well.
But I would agree with you, increasingly rare for companies that you've heard of. But there are plenty that unfortunately still, once we get pretty far along in the traceback, don't respond. But we're working on it. Rebecca, anything you want to add on that topic?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't want to say whether it should be a regulatory requirement, but we at Twilio feel very strongly that it's an obligation as a member of the telecom ecosystem, providing voice service over the public telephone network to keep that network free from abuse, fraud, and misconduct. It harms all of us when it's muddied with those bad calls, and then that hopefully allows companies like Twilio to be able to also ensure our customers and consumers that the calls that are being sent from our platform are wanted as well. So, like Chris and Verizon, we also require our customers to participate in the traceback. And was, I know Verizon was very much on the forefront in that, and we appreciated that because it kind of lit a fire on us to do the same. So, more can be done, perhaps.
No, it's really good, because as somebody said earlier, there's not any single thing any one of us can do, but it's got to be a cumulative effort. So all these things are important. So we're running out of time here. In the last 3 minutes, I think what I want to do is just ask each of you, is this working? Are we going to truly solve this problem? I mean, it feels insurmountable at times, and at the same time, it feels like we're making great progress at times. Is it working? Can we win this fight? And what is your message, if you will, to those who are out there preying on American consumers?
I'm happy to go first.
Sure.
I mean, I think it is working. I think it's working not just in statistics, but I do feel like we're seeing in the enterprise space a restoration of trust. So that's in large thanks to, again, a lot of these people on this panel. I think Jonathan said there's no silver bullet, but the combined effort of public policy, law enforcement, industry cooperation, and, you know, from Twilio's perspective, innovation too, that these illegal robocallers, their days are numbered, and there's more and more tools to stop these illegal robocalls, and it's really no longer worth your time and frankly worth your risk.
I'll jump in. I think it's absolutely working. It is putting transparency on actors that weren't readily transparent in the past. And it's making them transparent, not just to industry, but also to law enforcement. And I think, as you've seen and you'll continue to see, we're not shy about taking enforcement action. One measure of success has been, you know, the FTC receives consumer complaints, and consumer complaints about robocalls, do not call, were, you know, more than 500,000, upwards of close to 1 million at one point. We've seen a significant reduction in the number of complaints received compared to a year ago, and a precipitous drop started in December, perhaps in large measure due to the Globex action, and then the spiraling cases that DOJ was bringing and the warning letters. So I think that is a measure of success. I don't think we're going to cure this any more than we're going to cure fraud, because remember, a lot of these robocalls, they're not just abusive, they're peddling social security scams, credit card interest rate reductions. Fraudsters are not going to go away, but what we can do and are doing is raising their costs of doing business and increasing the barriers to entry.
Good. Go ahead, Ann.
Yeah, Patrick, I think they summed it up very well. I would note that I agree. We're not going to end it. Bacteria do evolve to, you know, find ways to bypass the body's defenses. So we're going to have to continue to strengthen and to work on it. But I absolutely think that what we're doing is having a material positive impact for consumers.
Good. All right, Ann, last word.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on what Lois said, I know all of us in law enforcement, fraud evolves endlessly, but we have been very encouraged to see measurable impacts like complaints to the FTC, lowering in robocalls, and also both our federal law enforcement partners and industry being creative in all of the tools that they're bringing to bear. I know the Justice Department is always trying to think about all of the civil and criminal enforcement tools, and always eager for referrals or partnership with both, you know, both federal and state partners and industry. So we're hopeful that this is a place where a lot of good minds are working together to combat this problem.
Great. Well, I'll answer my own question. I think it's working, and it's because of the collaboration among the people on this webinar and those who aren't here within the government and within industry. I want to thank everybody within the Industry Traceback Group. We have over 40 members at this point, from the wireline, wireless, cable, VoIP, wholesale, really all aspects of the telephone ecosystem. And it's the commitment of those companies, USTelecom members and beyond, to tackling this fight that's making this work. And we are proud of the work that we do. We're proud to provide that information to the enforcement community to help them do their jobs. And we're far from finished. There's a lot more work that needs to be done, but we're gonna keep doing it. We're gonna keep doing it as well as we possibly can. So thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you to Chairman Pai and Attorney General Weiser. If anybody has interested in joining the Industry Traceback Group, you can feel free to reach out to me directly. And thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick.
Take care, everybody. Stay healthy.